Everyone thinks the hard part is making the money work. They are wrong. The hard part was never splitting the Netflix bill or deciding who pays for groceries. The hard part is not letting the money conversation become the slow poison that dissolves what you spent years building together. The hard part is not turning a spreadsheet into a courtroom. The hard part is surviving the moment when one person earns 30% more than the other, and both of them pretend that doesn't matter. Here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody puts on a wedding invitation. Most couples don't fail at love. They fail at financial architecture. They build a life together without ever building a system. And then, around year 3 or year 7 or year 12, the bill comes due. Not the electricity bill, the emotional bill. The accumulated interest on every unspoken resentment, every silent sacrifice. Every time one person felt controlled or judged or invisible inside their own financial life. Financial advisors will tell you this is a communication problem. Therapists will tell you it's about attachment styles. Both of them are partially right and almost entirely useless, because they are treating the symptom, not the physics of the situation. Let me show you the physics. Everybody believes organizing a couple's budget is complicated. They imagine it requires spreadsheets, deep vulnerability, maybe a licensed mediator. They approach it like it's surgery, and so they delay. They avoid. They use vague phrases like, "We should talk about money sometime." And then somehow that sometime never arrives, because the moment never feels right, because the topic feels radioactive. But here's the flip. Setting up the system is actually the easy part. Any competent person can open a joint account in 40 minutes. Any motivated couple can sit down on a Sunday afternoon and divide expenses into categories. The mechanics are trivially simple. The math is basic arithmetic. There are no advanced concepts required. The genuinely hard problem, the one that breaks relationships, is not how to organize the budget. It's how to not destroy each other while you're doing it. It's how to talk about money without one person feeling interrogated and the other feeling abandoned. It's how to stay rational when the topic of money activates every childhood wound and status anxiety and fear of abandonment that both of you have been carrying since you were 10 years old. It's how to prevent the budget conversation from becoming a power struggle disguised as a financial discussion. That is the real problem, and almost nobody talks about it honestly. The conventional wisdom goes something like this. Sit down together, be transparent, be respectful, and everything will work out. Communicate openly. Use I statements. Don't assign blame. This advice is not wrong, it is just laughably insufficient. It's like telling someone to simply breathe more calmly before their first parachute jump. Technically accurate, practically useless. The real question is this: why does money specifically do this to people? Why does a conversation about a budget feel more dangerous than a conversation about almost anything else? Why do otherwise rational, loving, emotionally mature adults suddenly become adversaries the moment a spreadsheet appears? The answer is not psychological. Or rather, it is not only psychological. The answer is structural. It lives in the architecture of how financial inequality operates inside a household. And to understand it, you need to stop thinking about money as a neutral resource and start thinking about it as a force field with its own physics. Think about orbital mechanics for a moment. When a spacecraft tries to escape Earth's gravity, it doesn't matter how much effort the rocket engine applies in a linear, steady-state fashion. A rocket burning fuel at a low, constant rate will never leave the atmosphere. It will burn through all its propellant and crash back down, having produced an enormous amount of heat and noise and going exactly nowhere. What determines whether the spacecraft escapes or not is not effort. It is velocity at a critical threshold. Specifically, it needs to reach approximately 11.2 kilometers per second, the second cosmic velocity, the escape velocity, before the pull of gravity overcomes the thrust. Below that threshold, no amount of additional effort makes a fundamental difference. Above it, even a small amount of additional thrust dramatically changes the trajectory. This is the exact physics of financial inequality inside a couple. When two people come together with significantly different financial histories, different incomes, different debts, different baseline spending expectations, different childhood relationships to scarcity. They do not enter a neutral gravitational field. They enter a field with a specific shape, and that shape determines almost everything about how their financial conversations will feel, how power will distribute itself invisibly, and whether the relationship will slowly orbit toward a stable equilibrium or spiral toward disintegration. The person who earns more is not simply richer. They are operating at a different orbital velocity. They have more flexibility, more options, more margin for error. They experience money as abundant. They can afford to be philosophical about financial decisions because no single decision is existential for them. They can say, "Oh, it's just money," and actually mean it. The person who earns less, or who has more debt, or who came from a lower income background, is operating closer to the gravity well. Every financial decision feels heavier because it is heavier. There is less margin. There is less forgiveness built into the system. The same decision, splurging on a nice dinner, buying a piece of furniture, taking an unexpected trip, feels categorically different depending on which side of the gravitational threshold you're standing on. And here's the brutal part that nobody acknowledges in polite conversation. This difference in orbital velocity creates invisible power dynamics that operate continuously underneath the surface of even the most loving and well-intentioned relationship. The higher earner has more veto power, not because they want it, not because they demand it, but because money creates options, and options are freedom, and freedom is power. If the financial arrangement collapses, the higher earner's life is disrupted. The lower earner's life might be destroyed. That asymmetry shapes every negotiation, every compromise, every moment of "we decided together," even when both people are acting with complete good faith. This is not a character flaw. It is orbital mechanics. You cannot fight gravity with positive thinking. What you can do is design a system that accounts for the gravitational reality and builds compensating structures into the architecture of the relationship. But before we get to the architecture, you need to understand something even more uncomfortable about why the current situation, whatever it is costing you more than you think. There is a passage in a Terry Pratchett novel about a man named Sam Vimes, who grew up poor, who explains something profound about the economics of poverty. He calls it the boots theory. Here it is. A poor man buys cheap boots for $10. They last one season. He buys them again next year. Over 10 years, he has spent $100 on boots and his feet have been wet most of the time. A rich man buys boots for $50. They last 10 years. Over the same period, he has spent $50 on boots and his feet have been dry the whole time. The poor man cannot afford the cheap price of quality. He is trapped in a perpetual cycle of high-cost, low-durability transactions. Being poor is, paradoxically, the most expensive possible lifestyle. This principle operates with surgical precision inside couples with financial imbalance. Consider the cost of financial disorganization. When a couple has no clear budgeting system, no shared framework, no agreed-upon rules, no transparent accounting, every financial decision becomes an improvisation. And improvisation, in financial terms, is expensive. You pay overdraft fees. You miss early payment discounts. You make decisions based on incomplete information. You duplicate purchases. You fail to optimize taxes because neither person has full visibility into the household's financial picture. The estimated cost of this disorganization for a typical American household is between $2,000 and $5,000 per year in avoidable fees, missed opportunities, and redundant spending. That is money that evaporates not because of bad luck or insufficient income, but because of structural chaos. Now add the specific costs that fall disproportionately on the lower earner in an unstructured partnership. When there's no agreed system, financial decisions tend to default to whoever has more financial momentum. The higher earner's preferences, risk tolerance, and spending style become the de facto standard, not through explicit negotiation, but through the quiet authority of their economic position. The lower earner adapts. They suppress preferences. They avoid raising financial concerns because doing so feels like exposing a vulnerability or inviting a power imbalance they already feel acutely. And then the adaptation starts costing money in a different way. The lower earner begins self-censoring financial needs. They delay purchases they actually need. They avoid mentioning financial stress because it feels shameful in the context of the relationship. They take on invisible financial labor, tracking shared expenses mentally, compensating for the imbalance through non-financial contributions, doing the cognitive work of managing financial anxiety quietly, alone, in the middle of the night. This invisible labor has a measurable cost. Research in behavioral economics consistently shows that financial stress consumes approximately 13 points of effective IQ, not metaphorically, measurably. The cognitive bandwidth consumed by financial anxiety directly reduces the working memory, abstract reasoning, and executive function available for everything else: parenting, work performance, creative problem solving, and yes, emotional regulation in the relationship itself. So here is the Vimes-style calculation for a couple without a financial system. You are paying for dysfunction twice. Once in the direct financial costs of disorganization, the fees, the missed optimizations, the duplicated spending, and once in the cognitive tax, the mental and emotional bandwidth that financial stress destroys, which degrades every other aspect of the relationship. The couple that avoids the money conversation to preserve peace is not preserving peace. They are spending it on credit. The bill will arrive with interest. And the interest rate on avoided conversations is extraordinarily high. Here is something that never appears in relationship advice columns. Financial stress is a neurotoxin, not metaphorically, literally. Chronic financial stress, the low-grade, persistent, never quite resolved anxiety about whether you have enough, whether you're being judged, whether you're contributing enough, whether the relationship can survive the next unexpected expense, produces a sustained elevation in cortisol. And sustained cortisol elevation does specific, measurable damage to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, empathy, perspective taking, and the ability to regulate emotional responses. It is, not coincidentally, precisely the set of faculties you need most during a difficult financial conversation with your partner. Financial stress degrades the very cognitive hardware required to navigate financial stress. This is not a character weakness. This is neurobiology. The person who shuts down during money conversations is not being manipulative or passive-aggressive. Their prefrontal cortex has genuinely gone offline. They have been hijacked by the limbic system, the ancient, reactive, survival-oriented part of the brain that experiences a tense financial conversation with a partner as a threat nearly indistinguishable from physical danger. Their heart rate increases, their thinking narrows, their capacity for nuance collapses. They become, in a very real neurological sense, stupider. And the person who gets aggressive during money conversations is experiencing the same hijacking from the other direction. The aggression is not a personality trait. It is cortisol and adrenaline overriding the prefrontal regulation that would otherwise produce a reasonable, collaborative response. Both people are trapped in their biology, and they're having a financial conversation in this state, and then they wonder why it goes badly. There's a second biological layer operating simultaneously. Money, in modern consumer society, has become deeply entangled with dopamine, the neurotransmitter that drives anticipation, reward-seeking, and motivation. Spending money triggers a dopamine response. The anticipation of a purchase, the moment of acquisition, the brief glow of having something new. All of this activates the brain's reward circuitry in ways that are structurally similar to other addictive behaviors. For couples under financial stress, spending becomes self-medication. Not because either person is consciously choosing to cope through consumption, but because the brain, desperate for relief from the cortisol load of financial anxiety, seeks the most readily available dopamine hit, which is often a purchase, which often happens to be a purchase the other person doesn't know about, or wouldn't approve of, or that violates whatever informal financial agreement exists. And then you have the shame spiral, the secret purchase, the discovered credit card statement. The "why didn't you tell me" conversation that is not really about the purchase at all, but about the accumulated weight of feeling financially controlled, financially judged, financially invisible, and about seeking the only form of autonomy and reward that felt available, even if only briefly. This is not a morality problem. It is a systems design problem, and you can design your way out of it. The first move, and this is non-negotiable, is to stop trying to have productive financial conversations while you are both in a state of cortisol elevation. This sounds obvious. It is almost never practiced. Couples tend to have money conversations in the exact worst moments. After a surprise expense appears, after one person has been silently stewing about a financial grievance for 3 weeks, after a tense moment about something unrelated that suddenly morphs into a money argument, because money is the underlying current of all the other arguments. The monk mode of financial communication means creating a deliberate, structured, low-stakes context for money conversations before any crisis appears. It means scheduling, actually scheduling, as a recurring appointment. A brief financial check-in at a time when both people are fed, rested, not recently argued, and not under immediate deadline pressure. It means treating the financial conversation as a business meeting between two co-founders who respect each other, not as a tribunal. It also means, in the short term, implementing radical informational transparency. Before you can design a budget system, both people need to know the actual numbers, not the approximate numbers, not the numbers filtered through embarrassment or optimism. The actual numbers, income after tax, all debts and their interest rates, all recurring expenses, all irregular but predictable expenses, all financial obligations to people outside the relationship, and all assets. This is the moment that stops most couples, because real numbers are humiliating. Real numbers mean that one person's student loan balance, seen in black and white by their partner for the first time, can no longer be managed through strategic vagueness. Real numbers mean that one person's actual monthly spending, itemized and totaling $300 more than they had been representing, is no longer deniable. Real numbers mean the relationship has to encounter financial reality directly, without the buffer of mutual pretense. This is not comfortable. It is also the only way to build anything real. Think of it as the monk mode, precisely because it requires a kind of austerity, not necessarily of spending, but of self-deception. You are temporarily stripping away all the stories you tell about money and replacing them with arithmetic. This process will feel exposing. It is supposed to. You cannot build structural integrity on a foundation of optimistic approximations. Once both people have complete financial visibility, 3 possible architectural frameworks present themselves. And the choice between them is not primarily a financial decision. It is a decision about what kind of relationship you are designing. The first framework is the fully merged model. One pool. Everything goes in, everything comes out, and every financial decision is, by definition, a joint decision. This is the model that previous generations largely defaulted to, often without choosing it at all, simply inheriting it from cultural expectation. The implicit logic is appealing. We are a team. We share a life, therefore we share resources fully. There is no mine and yours. There is only ours. The genuine advantages of this model are real. Complete pooling maximizes the household's ability to optimize, to pay down high-interest debt fastest, to invest most efficiently, to take advantage of bulk pricing and long-term financial planning. It creates a unified balance sheet that is genuinely easier to manage as a single entity than as 2 parallel systems with complicated accounting between them. And at its best, it creates a powerful sense of shared fate and mutual investment. But the full pool model has a specific failure mode, and it is vicious. It eliminates individual financial autonomy entirely. When every dollar is shared, every individual expenditure is implicitly subject to the other person's judgment. Buying a new jacket is not just buying a jacket. It is a withdrawal from the joint fund, which means it is potentially a withdrawal from retirement savings, or the vacation fund, or the partner's desire for a new piece of furniture. Everything is in competition with everything else. Every personal preference has to be justified to another person. And when one person earns significantly more than the other, the full pool model can quietly calcify into a dynamic where the higher earner feels entitled to more financial authority, not explicitly, not deliberately, but inevitably, because it was largely their contribution that created the pool. The person who earns less in a full pool model faces a specific psychological trap. They experience their own spending as potentially parasitic. They begin to shrink their financial needs, to underspend on themselves relative to what they actually need, not because of budget constraints, but because of shame. They begin to ask permission in a relationship that is supposed to be a partnership, and they begin to resent the higher earner for a power imbalance that neither of them designed and that exists, on one level, entirely in their own heads, but is also structurally real. The full pool model requires extraordinary mutual maturity and an explicit commitment to treating income as inherently equal, regardless of its source. Without that explicit commitment, stated clearly, returned to regularly, defended actively against the quiet entropy of resentment, it tends to evolve into a model where money follows dominance. The second framework is the fully separate model. Two independent financial lives sharing a home and a relationship, but maintaining clean separation between their finances. Each person earns their own money, keeps their own accounts, manages their own financial life, and the shared expenses of living together are handled through a negotiated contribution arrangement. You pay for your life, I pay for mine. We split the rent. The appeal of this model is obvious. It preserves autonomy completely. It eliminates the judgment problem. What you spend your money on is your business. It eliminates the power imbalance that pooling can create. It keeps the financial relationship clean and transactional in a way that prevents money from becoming a mechanism of control. But the fully separate model has its own structural problem, and it is mathematically significant. Equal splits are not equitable splits. When two people with different incomes split expenses equally, the lower earner is paying a much higher proportion of their income for the same set of shared benefits. If one person earns $70,000 a year and the other earns $40,000, and they split rent, utilities, groceries, and shared activities equally at, say, $2,000 per month per person, the higher earner is spending 34% of their net income on shared household expenses. The lower earner is spending 60%. They are living in the same apartment, eating the same meals, but experiencing fundamentally different financial realities. Over time, this creates a structural divergence. The higher earner accumulates savings, builds investments, develops financial resilience. The lower earner, stretched to a higher proportion of their income, accumulates less, or nothing, and becomes increasingly financially dependent on the relationship for stability they can't build independently, which, paradoxically, recreates the power imbalance that the separate model was designed to avoid. The equal split model also fails catastrophically when one person temporarily stops earning, during parental leave, illness, job loss, or periods of career transition. The person who leaves the workforce is not only losing income, they are losing their entire financial identity and independence in a model specifically designed around financial independence. The psychological impact of this is severe, and the resentment it generates is long-lived. Which brings us to the hybrid model. And the hybrid model is not a compromise between the other two, in the sense of being a weakened version of both. It is a different architecture entirely, one designed specifically to account for the gravitational physics described earlier. The hybrid model operates on a proportional contribution principle. The total shared expenses of the household, rent or mortgage, utilities, groceries, shared subscriptions, joint savings goals, are calculated. Each person contributes to a joint account in proportion to their income, not in equal absolute amounts. If the household needs $4,000 per month to cover shared expenses, and one person earns $70,000 and the other earns $40,000, the higher earner contributes approximately 64% of that amount, and the lower earner contributes approximately 36%. Each person then retains a proportional amount of personal spending money from their individual income. This structure accomplishes something the other two models cannot. It equalizes the financial burden as a proportion of capacity rather than as an absolute number. Both people feel the same financial weight. Neither person is stretched disproportionately. The shared life costs the same relative amount to both participants, and each person retains genuine individual financial autonomy, a private allocation of their own money over which they exercise complete control. No questions asked, no justification required. The private allocation is not an allowance. This distinction matters enormously. An allowance is what a parent gives a child. It implies hierarchy. The private allocation is a contractual right built into the architecture of the partnership. It belongs to each person as a structural element of the agreement, not as a permission granted by the partner with more income. One person's private allocation is larger in absolute terms. The other's is smaller. But both exist as rights, not privileges. This seemingly simple design feature eliminates an enormous amount of financial tension. When both people have genuine, no questions asked spending money, the dopamine self-medication problem diminishes dramatically. The person who was buying secret items is no longer doing so because their autonomy was suppressed. They now have a designated pool of resources that is theirs and only theirs. The secret purchase is no longer necessary because the purchase doesn't need to be secret. Financial shame drops. Resentment drops. The need to seek financial autonomy through hidden behavior drops. But the hybrid model is not self-implementing. It requires 3 specific conversations to function. And these conversations are the ones most couples never have, which is why the system breaks down even when the architecture is theoretically correct. The first conversation is the income conversation. Both incomes on the table, fully visible, without shame or apology. Not the aspirational income. Not the income after optimistic projections. The actual currently arriving income, including any irregular sources. This conversation is uncomfortable primarily because couples often maintain deliberate vagueness about income as a way of avoiding the power dynamics that explicit knowledge creates. Knowing that your partner earns 40% more than you do is different from vaguely sensing it. The explicit knowledge forces both people to confront the structural reality directly. The hybrid model requires this confrontation. You cannot build a proportional system without proportional data. What makes this conversation survivable is framing. The income conversation is not a judgment. It is an engineering measurement. When a structural engineer measures the load-bearing capacity of 2 different columns, they are not ranking the column's worth. They are gathering the data required to design a safe structure. That is the only lens through which the income conversation should be conducted. Different numbers, same value as human beings, same claim on the shared life. The second conversation is the values conversation, and it is far more emotionally complex than the income conversation. This is the conversation about what each person believes money is for, not what they say they believe, what their behavior reveals. This conversation surfaces the deep incompatibilities that destroy budgets from the inside. One person who grew up in financial scarcity and experiences saving as safety and spending as danger, paired with a person who grew up in middle-class comfort and experiences spending as participation in life and excessive saving as anxiety-driven hoarding. Neither of these value systems is objectively correct, but they will generate constant friction unless they are named explicitly and incorporated into the system's design. The values conversation should cover several specific areas: spending on experiences versus things, the importance of financial security versus the importance of present quality of life, attitudes toward debt, as a tool to be leveraged versus as a source of existential anxiety, attitudes toward family financial obligations. Should you help a struggling sibling, support aging parents, maintain certain lifestyle expectations inherited from your family of origin? What does financial success look like to each person, and are those visions compatible? These are not comfortable questions. They are also not optional if you want to build a system that doesn't require constant renegotiation. The time you spend on the values conversation is an investment that pays compounding returns in reduced conflict. The time you skip on the values conversation is debt that accumulates invisibly until it becomes unpayable. The third conversation is the contingency conversation. What happens when the proportions change? What happens when one person loses their job, or takes parental leave, or decides to start a business that doesn't generate income for 18 months? What happens when a significant inheritance lands in one person's account? What happens when one person's income grows dramatically while the other's stays flat? These events are not unlikely hypotheticals. They are the predictable inflection points of any long-term partnership. Building the response into the architecture before the crisis occurs is exponentially easier than negotiating it during the crisis. The contingency conversation should produce explicit, written agreements about how the system adapts to specific scenarios, not vague reassurances, specific numbers, and specific processes. If one of us stops earning for reasons outside our control, the contributing partner covers shared expenses fully for up to 12 months without changing the allocation of the other person's personal funds. Something that concrete, something you both sign. Not because you don't trust each other, but because the version of you that negotiates this agreement in a calm Sunday afternoon in year 2 is significantly more rational and generous than the version of you that will try to negotiate it in a moment of financial crisis in year 6. Now let's talk about the architecture of the conversation itself, because you can have the right model and still detonate the relationship with the wrong conversational approach. The highest stakes risk in financial conversations is what behavioral economists call reactive devaluation, the automatic tendency to value a proposal less because of who made it. When your partner suggests a financial arrangement, you are not evaluating the arrangement in isolation. You are evaluating it through the filter of every previous financial interaction with them, every power dynamic, every anxiety, every memory of the last time you gave ground and regretted it. This means that an objectively reasonable proposal can feel threatening or manipulative purely because of the relationship context in which it arrives. The antidote to reactive devaluation is procedural fairness. Both people need to experience the process of reaching the financial agreement as fair, not just the outcome. This requires structural balance in who speaks, who generates proposals, who reviews and critiques. It requires explicit acknowledgement of each person's stated concerns before moving to solutions. It requires time, not the time pressure of, we need to figure this out tonight, but the time of genuine deliberation. One highly effective procedural technique is the written proposal model. Instead of having the financial conversation as a real-time negotiation, each person independently writes down their proposed model, their rationale, and their non-negotiables. These proposals are exchanged simultaneously, not shared one at a time, where the second person is reacting to the first rather than expressing their independent view. The simultaneous exchange creates a starting point that reflects both people's independent thinking, rather than a dynamic where one person's first offer anchors the negotiation. Another critical procedural principle is the separation of the money conversation from every other conversation. Money talks must not happen in the same session as conflict about anything else. The moment financial discussion becomes entangled with an argument about housework or parenting or the in-laws, the financial content becomes a proxy battlefield for the other conflict, and rational decision-making becomes impossible. This sounds like an obvious rule. It is violated in virtually every relationship, constantly. The specific language used in financial conversations also has measurable consequences. Language that attributes financial behaviors to character is extraordinarily destructive and almost universally inaccurate. You are irresponsible with money is not just hurtful. It is analytically wrong. Irresponsibility is a behavior pattern, not a character trait. And behavior patterns are produced by specific triggers, specific histories, specific neurological states, all of which are addressable at the systems level. The productive version of the same concern is, when the credit card statement arrives unexpectedly higher than projected, I feel anxious, and I need to understand what caused the difference. Can we build a system where we both have visibility into that in real time? This distinction, behavior and systems versus character and judgment, is the single most important language discipline in financial communication. The person who describes their partner's financial behavior as a character flaw has closed the door on every constructive solution. The person who describes it as a systems problem has opened a dozen doors. There is a social physics problem operating outside the relationship that actively works against implementing any of this. When a couple begins to get serious about financial architecture, when they start having the real conversations, building the real systems, making the genuine changes, they immediately encounter resistance from their social environment. Not always malicious resistance, often well-meaning resistance, but structurally, it operates like the crab bucket effect, the tendency of a group to pull down any individual who is attempting to escape the group's level. The resistance takes specific forms. Friends who mock the idea of budgeting as uptight or unromantic. Family members who are offended by the idea that you are prioritizing savings over shared celebrations. Social circles whose baseline spending level is above what your new system allows. The partner's previous financial identity, the spender, the saver, the person who never tracked anything, suddenly being challenged by a new framework that requires them to become someone different. This is not trivial resistance. It operates through exactly the cortisol and dopamine mechanisms described earlier. The social pressure to maintain existing consumption patterns is neurological. The discomfort of being the person who can't do what everyone else is doing activates genuine threat responses. The relationship between social belonging and consumption in modern Western culture is so deeply entrenched that deviating from the group's financial norms literally feels dangerous to the brain's social circuitry. The response to this is not to white-knuckle through the social pressure through sheer willpower. Willpower is a depletable resource that degrades under cortisol load. The response is to be strategic about the information environment, to selectively and temporarily reduce exposure to the social contexts that generate the most spending pressure, to actively build an alternative information environment, through books, through audio content, through communities of people who are navigating similar financial transitions, that normalizes the behaviors you are trying to build. This is not isolation. It is curation. The difference matters. Isolation is defensive and anxious. Curation is deliberate and architectural. You are not hiding from the world. You are building a specific cognitive environment that makes the behaviors you want to sustain feel normal rather than exceptional. You are replacing accidental influences with chosen ones. The books matter here more than most people realize. When you are building a new financial identity, which is what restructuring a couple's budget actually requires, you need evidence that the identity is real, viable, and inhabited by people you respect. Reading about how others have navigated the specific challenges you're facing provides that evidence. It also provides the conceptual vocabulary to discuss financial decisions in ways that feel principled rather than merely restrictive. The couple that has built a shared financial language, shared concepts, shared references, shared frameworks for thinking about money, is dramatically better equipped to navigate financial decisions than the couple that is improvising vocabulary in real time. The final layer of the architecture is the one that determines whether all of this is temporary effort or permanent transformation. The difference between a couple that successfully restructures their financial life and one that reverts within 18 months is not motivation. It is not intelligence. It is not the specific model they chose. It is whether they successfully crossed the threshold from consuming money to owning money. From being on the side of the equation where money flows away from you to being on the side where it flows toward you. This threshold is specific and numerical. When the household's monthly cash flow from assets, investments, rental income, interest, dividends begins to cover any meaningful percentage of fixed expenses, the psychological relationship to money changes categorically. Even 5%. Even $100 a month coming from an investment account rather than from labor. This is not about the dollar amount. It is about the proof of principle. It is about experiencing firsthand that money can be put to work generating more money. That the mathematical compounding that makes wealthy people wealthy is not a secret available only to them, but an arithmetic reality accessible to anyone with positive cash flow. The couple that discovers this together, that their joint savings account, however modest, is beginning to accumulate compound interest, that their retirement contributions from last year have earned returns without any additional effort from either of them, that they are, incrementally but genuinely, beginning to build something that works while they sleep. This couple develops a shared financial identity built around growth rather than management. They are no longer trying to stop money from leaking. They are directing its flow. And this shared project transforms the financial conversation from a negotiation about scarcity to a collaboration about strategy. The couple that is managing scarcity is, neurologically, under cortisol load in every money conversation. The couple that is building something together is, neurologically, in a creative and collaborative state. These are different conversations. They feel different. They produce different outcomes. And they are available to any couple willing to do the architectural work required to get there. You have read this far. That tells you something. Most people will scan the headline, absorb the general idea that they should communicate openly about money, and return unchanged to the system that is slowly degrading their relationship. They will continue having money conversations reactively, in states of cortisol elevation, without clear frameworks, without transparency, without the explicit agreements that would remove the ambiguity that generates conflict. They will continue paying the high cost of structural chaos, the financial waste, the cognitive bandwidth consumption, the accumulated emotional debt. And they will continue attributing the resulting relationship strain to incompatibility or bad luck, or the idea that money is just inherently a difficult topic. Money is not inherently a difficult topic. An undesigned system is a difficult topic. A relationship where financial power operates invisibly is a difficult topic. A partnership where both people are operating under chronic cortisol load, making dopamine-driven decisions, and trying to communicate about complex financial trade-offs with degraded prefrontal function. That is a difficult topic. But systems can be designed. Power can be made visible and then redistributed deliberately. Cortisol load can be reduced through structural change. Dopamine patterns can be interrupted and redirected. The prefrontal cortex can be protected through timing, environment, and procedural discipline. None of this requires perfection. None of it requires that both people become financial experts, or that all conflict disappear, or that the underlying differences in financial history and values evaporate. Two people with genuinely incompatible money personalities can build a functional shared financial life if the architecture accounts for the incompatibility rather than pretending it doesn't exist. The cage is open. It has always been open. The question is whether you are willing to step outside the gravitational field of the default, the unexamined inheritance of how your parents handled money, of what your social circle normalizes, of the cultural narrative that says money conversations are unromantic and financial planning is for uptight people who rather than release pressure. A shared project that uses the mathematics of compounding growth rather than fighting the mathematics of compound dysfunction. This is what financial partnership actually looks like when it works. Not two people who never argue about money. Two people who have built something together that neither could build alone. A structure with enough integrity to hold real weight, real disagreement, real difference, and still stand. Build the structure. Do the math. Have the conversations before the crisis forces them. Protect your cognitive hardware. Design the system that works for the relationship you actually have, not the idealized version of it. The escape velocity is there. You just have to choose to reach it together.